Asterisk before you watch this incredible story about a mother who couldn't recognize her own son for 8 years, and the shocking truth that changed everything, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the moment when the identity is revealed and justice is served. Hit the notification bell to stay updated, asterisk. It was a Saturday morning when Margaret received a phone call that would change her life forever. A man's voice on the other end said, "Hello, Mother. It's me. It's David. I'm coming home." Margaret's heart stopped. David was her son. But she hadn't heard from David in 8 years. 8 years of silence. 8 years of not knowing where he was or if he was even alive. The man who showed up at her house that afternoon looked nothing like her son. This man was tall, muscular, and scarred. His face was weathered. His eyes were cold and distant. He had a tattoo running down his arm, something David would never have done. Margaret didn't recognize him. She thought it was an imposter. She thought it was someone trying to scam her. She called the police. But what emerged over the next few days was a truth so shocking, so devastating, that it would shake Margaret's entire world to its foundation. Build the story slowly and clearly. Margaret Wilson had been a loving mother her entire life. She had raised David and his younger sister, Sarah, as a single mother after her husband had left when David was just 5 years old. Margaret had worked as a nurse at a local hospital. She had worked double shifts to make sure her children had everything they needed. David had been a good child. He had been intelligent, kind, and compassionate. He had gotten good grades in school. He had loved to read and to paint. He had dreamed of becoming an artist. When David was 14 years old, he had started hanging around with the wrong crowd. He had started getting into trouble at school. He had started skipping classes. He had started experimenting with drugs. Margaret had tried everything to help him. She had taken him to counseling. She had set strict rules. She had tried to keep him away from negative influences. But David had been determined to go down a destructive path. By the time David was 16, he had been arrested twice for possession of drugs. At 17, he had been caught stealing from a convenience store. At 18, he had run away from home. Margaret had been devastated. She had filed a missing persons report with the police. She had hired a private investigator. She had done everything she could to find her son. But David didn't want to be found. For 8 years, Margaret had heard nothing from her son. No phone calls. No letters. No contact of any kind. Sarah had finished high school, gone to college, and started her own life. But Margaret had remained broken-hearted about David. Margaret had kept David's room exactly as it was the day he left. She had kept his paintings on the walls. She had kept his books on the shelves. She had refused to let go of hope that one day, he would come home. Make viewers emotionally invested. When the man claiming to be David showed up at Margaret's door, she was shocked and confused. "I'm sorry, but I don't know you," Margaret had said. "My son would never look like that." The man had looked hurt. "It's me, Mom. It's David. I know I look different, but it's me." "You're not my son," Margaret had said firmly. "My son is gone. I don't know who you are, but I'm calling the police." She had called 911, and police had arrived within 10 minutes. Margaret had explained to the officers that this man was claiming to be her son, but she didn't believe him. She had shown the officers pictures of David from when he was younger. The officers had been skeptical. It's not unusual for people to change appearance over 8 years, one officer had said, especially if they've been homeless or in difficult circumstances. But Margaret had insisted that this wasn't her son. She had been adamant. The officers had told the man that he would need to provide identification or leave the property. The man had left without argument. Over the next few days, Margaret had been troubled by the encounter. Something about it had stuck with her. The man had known personal details about her life. He had known about her job as a nurse. He had known about Sarah. He had known things that only David would know. But Margaret had convinced herself that this man had somehow researched her. She had convinced herself that he was an imposter trying to scam her or hurt her. Then, Margaret's sister had called. Margaret's sister, Patricia, lived in a different city and hadn't been part of the recent encounter. "Margaret, I need to tell you something," Patricia had said. I ran into a young man at the grocery store. He looked awful, like he'd been through a lot. But he asked me about you. He asked about Sarah. He knew details about our family that I've never told anyone. Margaret's heart had started racing. What did he look like? Patricia had described the same man who had shown up at Margaret's door. Did he say his name was David? Margaret had asked. Yes, Patricia had said. He said he was looking for his mother. He said he'd been in prison for the past 8 years. Margaret's world had stopped spinning for a moment. Prison. David had been in prison. Margaret had contacted the man's number. He had left a note with his phone number at her door. She had asked him to come back and explain everything. This time, Margaret had listened. The man had told her a story that was heartbreaking and shocking. His name was David Wilson. He was her son. 8 years ago, he had been arrested for armed robbery. He had been part of a group of teenagers who had robbed a convenience store. A gun had been involved, though David had insisted he hadn't known about the gun. David had been convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison. He had spent every day of those 8 years in prison, working on rehabilitating himself. He had earned his GED. He had attended vocational training programs. He had participated in therapy. He had become a different person. The changes to his appearance had been the result of prison life. He had been in fights. He had gotten scars. He had tattoos from prison. He had lost weight and then gained muscle from working out. 8 years in prison had physically transformed him. But more than that, prison had emotionally and psychologically transformed him. David had regretted his crimes. He had expressed genuine remorse. He had worked on becoming a better person. Margaret had listened to her son's story, and she had wept. She had realized that the man in front of her really was her son. She had realized that she had judged him on his appearance without listening to his explanation. Margaret had apologized profusely to David. She had embraced him. She had told him that she loved him and that she was proud of him for changing his life. But Margaret's initial rejection had hurt David deeply. He had spent years in prison thinking about his mother, dreaming about the day he would be released and could go home. He had imagined that his mother would be waiting for him with open arms. Instead, he had been rejected. He had been treated like an imposter. He had been humiliated. David had moved in with Margaret, but there was a wall between them. David was polite, but distant. Margaret could see the pain in his eyes. She could see that her initial rejection had wounded him in a way that was difficult to repair. # karma or the big reveal. Over the next weeks, Margaret began to investigate her son's story more thoroughly. She went to the prison where David had been incarcerated. She spoke with counselors and educators who had worked with David. They all told her the same thing. David had been a model prisoner. He had worked hard to rehabilitate himself. He had been genuinely sorry for his crimes. One counselor, a man named Dr. James Peterson, told Margaret, "Your son is one of the most remarkable young men I've worked with in my 30 years of working in the prison system. He came in as an angry, troubled teenager. He left as a thoughtful, remorseful adult. I believe he will never commit another crime. He has genuinely changed." Margaret also spoke with the man who had been the victim of the robbery that David had participated in. The victim's name was George, and he owned the convenience store. George had testified against David at trial. Margaret had been nervous about contacting George, but when she did, George had been surprisingly compassionate. "I'm not going to lie," George had said. "What happened to my store affected me. I was traumatized. But your son was just a kid. He was mixed up with the wrong people. I've read about his record in prison. I've seen that he's turned his life around. I forgive him. I really do. Kids make mistakes. What matters is whether they learn from those mistakes and change. Your son has done that." Margaret had been moved by George's forgiveness and compassion. She had shared George's words with David. Hearing that the man he had victimized had forgiven him had been transformative for David. It had been a sign that he could move forward. It had been a sign that his past didn't have to define his future. Margaret and David had begun family therapy together. In therapy, they had talked about Margaret's initial rejection of David. They had talked about how difficult it had been for David to be rejected by the one person he had been dreaming about for 8 years. "When you didn't recognize me, I felt like my entire world collapsed," David had told Margaret in therapy. "I had spent 8 years in prison thinking about coming home to you. I had imagined that you would be happy to see me. I had imagined that you would be proud of me for changing. And then you rejected me. You thought I was an imposter. You called the police on me." Margaret had apologized again and again. She had explained that she hadn't been able to handle the shock of how different he looked. She had explained that fear had driven her reaction. "I was afraid," Margaret had said. "I was afraid that if I let myself believe it was you, and then it wasn't, the pain would destroy me. So I built a wall. And I hurt you in the process. I'm so sorry, David. I'm so deeply sorry." Through therapy, they had slowly rebuilt their relationship. Margaret had learned to see past David's appearance and to recognize her son in the person he had become. David had learned to forgive his mother's initial rejection and to understand that it came from a place of fear and pain, not malice. The moral takeaway. 1 year after David's release from prison, Margaret was interviewed by a local news station about her experience. "I made a terrible mistake," Margaret said on camera. "When my son came home, I couldn't recognize him. I was so focused on his appearance that I couldn't see the person he had become. I want to apologize to David publicly. I want to tell anyone who is watching that if you have a loved one who is coming back into your life, whether from prison or from being away for any reason, please don't judge them by their appearance. Look into their eyes. Listen to their story. Because people can change. People can grow. People can become better versions of themselves." The interview had been shared on social media and had gone viral. Margaret's message had resonated with millions of people. More importantly, Margaret's story had opened a conversation about the criminal justice system and rehabilitation. Many people had commented on how they had been moved by David's transformation and by Margaret's willingness to recognize and celebrate it. David had also spoken publicly about his experience. He had given speeches at schools and community centers about the dangers of gangs and drugs, and about the possibility of redemption and rehabilitation. "I made serious mistakes," David had said in one speech. "I committed a crime. I went to prison. But I used my time in prison to become a better person. If you're young and you're thinking about going down a destructive path, I want you to know that it's not too late to change. You can turn your life around. But it takes work. It takes commitment. And it takes people who believe in you." David had also volunteered at the same prison where he had served his sentence. He had worked with young inmates, mentoring them and helping them see that rehabilitation was possible. 2 years after David's release, he had been hired as a counselor at a youth rehabilitation center. He had used his own experience to help troubled young people see that they could change their lives. David's work at the rehabilitation center had been so impactful that he had eventually been promoted to supervisor. He had helped hundreds of young people turn their lives around. Margaret had watched her son's transformation with joy and pride. She had come to understand that the man who had shown up at her door was not a stranger. He was her son, a better version of her son than he had been before he went to prison. Prison, as terrible as it had been, had changed him for the better. Margaret had also become an advocate for criminal justice reform. She had spoken about the importance of rehabilitation in the prison system. She had talked about the possibility of redemption for people who had committed crimes. "My son was a good person who made bad choices," Margaret had said in a speech to a criminal justice reform organization. But the system didn't give up on him. Prison gave him the opportunity to rehabilitate himself. He took advantage of that opportunity. Now he's helping others do the same. This is what rehabilitation looks like. This is what is possible when we believe in people's ability to change. 5 years after David's release from prison, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. At her funeral, hundreds of people came to pay their respects. There were people David had mentored. There were other formerly incarcerated people who had been helped by programs David had worked with. There were people whose lives had been changed by Margaret and David's story. David delivered the eulogy for his mother. "My mother taught me what real love is," David said through his tears. "She taught me that love means believing in someone even when they've made mistakes. Love means seeing the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves. My mother initially couldn't recognize me when I came home from prison, but she took the time to listen to my story. She took the time to see who I had become. And in doing that, she taught me the most important lesson of my life, that it's never too late to change. It's never too late to become the person you want to be. David continued his work at the Rehabilitation Center for the rest of his career. He eventually became the director of the center. He transformed the program, making it one of the most successful rehabilitation programs in the state. The success of the program was measured not just in statistics, but in lives changed. Hundreds of young people who had been on destructive paths had been redirected. Hundreds of young people had learned that they could change. Hundreds of young people had been given hope. Many of them credited David with saving their lives. David had also written a book about his experience titled 8 Years, A Journey from Prison to Purpose. The book detailed his time in prison, his release, his difficult reunion with his mother, and his work helping other young people. The book had become a bestseller. It had been required reading in many schools and universities. It had inspired millions of people to reconsider their views on criminal justice, rehabilitation, and redemption. David had also been selected as a CNN hero for his work helping formerly incarcerated youth. He had been invited to speak at universities and conferences around the world about rehabilitation and redemption. But despite all of these accolades, David's proudest achievement remained simple: being a good son to his mother and a positive influence in the lives of young people who needed guidance. Clap aboard the final lesson. This story teaches us something profound about appearance, redemption, and the power of second chances. Margaret initially judged her son based on his appearance. She saw scars, tattoos, and a weathered face, and she couldn't reconcile these things with her memory of her son. She was so focused on what he looked like that she almost missed the opportunity to reunite with him. But when Margaret took the time to listen to David's story, when she took the time to see who he had become, everything changed. She realized that her son had changed for the better. She realized that prison, as terrible as it had been, had given him the opportunity to rehabilitate himself and to become a better person. The lesson for all of us is this: never judge a person by their appearance. Never assume that a person hasn't changed just because they look different. Take the time to listen to people's stories. Take the time to see who they have become, not just who they were. And most importantly, believe in the possibility of redemption. Believe that people can change. Believe that people can overcome their mistakes and become better versions of themselves. David's journey from troubled teenager to prison inmate to rehabilitated human being to counselor helping others is a testament to the power of redemption and the importance of second chances. If this story about redemption, recognition, and the power of seeing beyond appearances moved you, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story about people who have overcome their past and become better versions of themselves. Hit the notification bell to stay updated. And in the comments below, share your thoughts about this story. Do you believe people can truly change? Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance? Your perspective matters, and I'd love to hear it at about this story. This story was crafted to illustrate the importance of not judging people by their appearance and the power of redemption and rehabilitation. It's a reminder that people can change, especially when given the opportunity and support. The story also highlights the importance of the criminal justice system being focused on rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Most importantly, it shows that love and forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds and that it's never too late for someone to become a better version of themselves.